want to start by just thanking the Santa Cruz Public Libraries and the Watsonville Public Library for inviting myself and these other local faith leaders together. We've got a really wonderful collection of community leaders and different faith traditions with us today. And we're going to be discussing today, it's a sensitive topic around grief and loss and how we're all experiencing that in different ways while sheltering in place. My name is Derek Tim. I'm the vice mayor up in Scotts Valley, and I was really honored to be asked to join today to do this because it's something I think that we are all experiencing in very different ways. You know, it's a historic time we're in right now, and I think we're all feeling a very strange sensation, being cut off from our routines and our friends and our neighbors and loved ones in ways we haven't before in the past. And my family, we were having a hard time with it, certainly. And we couldn't really put a name to what we were experiencing. And then I read an article that talked about how what many of us are experiencing is simply grief and loss over those normal things in our life right now. And I see some people shaking their heads out there. You know, and we have grief and loss we're feeling in so many different ways and what those emotions are and how to deal with them. You know, in our family, we're missing life events with our kids that we would enjoy. We're missing seeing family members. And our kids are grieving these things, and my wife's grieving these things, and I'm grieving them, and our friends are grieving them. But, you know, there's also people that are grieving right now in isolation. And this is something we're doing as a community. And so talking about this in terms of the experience we're having globally as a community and how to deal with this is something that we wanted to discuss today. And so I want to thank our four wonderful panelists that are joining me here. And we have, I'm going to go through you, each of you one by one, ask you to introduce yourselves and maybe talk a little bit about your faith tradition. And I'm just going to do this in alphabetical order. And so I'll start off with Shannon Frediani, and then I'll move on to Reverend Dan Hoffman and Senior Rabbi Paula Marcus, and finally Chaplain Suzanne Semmes. So if I could ask Shannon Frediani to please introduce yourself and kind of give us some perspectives on your faith and background as well.
Very much. And I also would first like to start with gratitude, not only to the organization.
I think we're having a hard time hearing you, Shannon.
No.
There we go. Much better.
Okay, great. Well, I wanted to start with gratitude as well to yourself, all panelists, and also to listeners out there, even though I can't see them, and to the other panelists, so thank you. I am a person who, my parents were Methodists. I was brought up Methodist. I left as a teen. But I am a member currently of Santa Cruz Friends meeting here in Santa Cruz, which are commonly known as Quakers, for those who might not be familiar with Santa Cruz Friends. However, I really come to today's panel with more experience because of my having done outreach work with the incarcerated, primarily actually in Salinas at the Monterey County Jail for 15 years. Ironically enough, it was that volunteer work that led me to go back to school because I felt like I didn't have the professional skills in regards to chaplaincy and dealing with loss and grief. And this is well, you already said it. You didn't even know until you read that article. It's also very common for people who are separated from family when they're incarcerated. And so I'll talk later. I would actually like to talk briefly about what those, what grief and loss can feel like or look like, but I would like to let others finish their introductions before I launch into that.
Great. Okay, we'll come back to you on that. Then let's move on to Reverend Hoffman, please.
Well, hello. It's nice to be a part of this, and I got to know our colleagues a little bit in our trial run, and it's nice to see you all again. So I'm Pastor Dan Hoffman, and I'm the pastor at Westview Presbyterian Church in Watsonville. It's a 122-year-old Japanese-American Presbyterian congregation, and I've been there for a little over 10 years. I was raised Catholic, and have been to lots of different churches in between. I got my degree in psychology from UC Davis, and my master's in divinity at Fuller Theological Seminary. And my other capacity, it's part of why I'm here, is I'm a hospice chaplain with CCVNA and Hospice, and that's based out of Salinas and Monterey, but we also have some parts of Santa Cruz. And I've been doing that for like 13 years, so that's part of why I'm here. Part of my passion is helping do service work in other countries. So I got to be in Guatemala, Tijuana, Navajo Nation, Los Angeles and San Francisco inner city, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and our border in San Diego. My wife's a clinical social worker who works at Family Service Center in Santa Cruz. And then I have two children who are sheltering in right now and hopefully being quiet. A high school junior, and my son is a sophomore at Cal Poly who's doing online classes now at home, sheltering in. So I'm pleased to be here and looking forward to hear what my colleagues have to say and to have this discussion about what it means to grieve and loss as we shelter in and are in the midst of a pandemic. So I'm grateful to be here.
Thank you, Reverend. And I'm also an Aggie and have a junior as well at home. So I'm sure that we have lots to catch up on after this. So wonderful. Thank you for being here. Next, I'd like to invite Senior Rabbi Paula Marcus to introduce herself.
Thank you so much, everybody. It's really good to be on this meeting together. And I also want to say deep gratitude to the library systems for calling us to do this. And when the invitation came for which topics I was most interested in, this was the one. I've been involved in Jewish leadership my whole life, actually, and I grew up immersed in a liberal Jewish community in New York. My mentor was a cantor, and that's the person that leads the music, as well as being clergy member in a congregation. I grew up in a community where social justice was very important. It was part of my Jewish identity. And I came to Santa Cruz in 1980 and started working at Temple Bethel as a preschool teacher and religious school director and teacher, and then as a cantorial soloist, and about 16 years ago was ordained as a rabbi. Temple Bethel, for those of you who don't know, is a Reformed synagogue. We've got about 530 families, and we're located in Aptos, and we're a liberal community. I also helped to create the Fever Kadisha, which translates as the Holy Society, or some people like to say the Holy Friends, and that was over 25 years ago. And the Fever Kadisha is the group of volunteers who help to care for people's bodies after they die, so involved in the ritual preparation for burial. And it's a traditional practice, and it's not that common for there to be one in more liberal and not as traditional communities, but that movement has spread quite a bit. And so now we have Fever Kadisha all over the country and all over the world who have been innovating different ways of processing the rituals around caring for those, both as people are dying and after they die. The other thing I think I should mention, a couple more things, is that every year when our high holidays come around, Jews have the opportunity to really reflect on our lives, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And Yom Kippur some see as a rehearsal for death, meaning we fast, we wear white, which is what the traditional garb would be for burial. And I always speak of death, because I always feel like that's my opportunity. So I just should say that this topic is very important to me. Also want to mention that I've gone on retreats with Ram Dass for the last 10 years. Buddhist Hindu teacher who also connected to Buddhism, and he is always very focused on death and dying. He just passed this last December. And the last thing I want to share is that my husband teaches at Insight Santa Cruz. He's a retired LCSW, and he has been in treatment for a very rare cancer this past 2 years. So this is a very personal journey for me as well. So I'm really grateful to be a part of this and be able to share these thoughts and feelings and ideas with all of you.
We're grateful to have you here too. Thank you for sharing that, Rabbi. And last but not least, I'd love to introduce Suzanne Semmes. She is our chaplain here. If you could give us a little background on yourself, Suzanne.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Reverend Suzanne Semmes. I work at Dominican Hospital, Santa Cruz. It's the 4th hospital that I've worked in as a professional chaplain, and I've been there on and off since 2008. During that time, I also worked 3 years for Hospice of Santa Cruz County as a chaplain. And prior to that, I worked as a university chaplain on the East Coast. So I have that experience with a university culture and with both students, faculty, parents, and visitors in a context of chaplaincy to a community, as well as chaplaincy in an institution where people are coming to be healed. I was raised Episcopal in Washington, D.C. I lived for 10 years in London, where I explored many religions, and have landed now ordained as a Theravada Buddhist teacher and counselor by a temple in Sacramento. And I'm affiliated and do my Christian ministry from Peace United Church of Christ here in Santa Cruz.
Wow.
I've worked as a grief counselor as well. And for the last 8 or 10 years, I've been with Threshold Choir Santa Cruz, and we sing in groups of 2s and 3s to 5s at the bedsides of people birthing, dying, healing, and at memorial services for people. We are not doing that right now, except virtually, but we are a group that is committed to bringing music and light at those times when other words may not be the most helpful thing. And I have a particular interest and specialized in my chaplaincy work in the material culture of death, which includes images, paintings, jewelry, clothing, and those things which help people grieve, in addition to the usual rituals that each culture undertakes. My specialty was arts in the ministry in my clinical pastoral education. And also poetry and literature are important parts of my responses to grief and loss, and things that I try to evoke from people when they're experiencing grief and loss. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, what a terrific panel we have here today. And I hope that people remember to write in questions that we'll be looking at later, because this is really an opportunity to hear from some amazing, I mean, the wealth of experience here is phenomenal. Let's start. And Shannon, you started to talk, you wanted to talk about this first, you mentioned. So let's start with you on the first question, which is, how does your faith tradition understand the role of grieving and its perspective on loss? Could you share some thoughts about that? And then I'd be happy to kind of go around to everyone else in the group and hear from you as well. But Shannon, do you feel comfortable starting with that one?
Sure, I'm happy to start with that. I'm going to nuance the question. The one I have is, how does your faith tradition or chaplaincy vocation understand the role of grieving?
Yes.
And the reason why I bring that up is I'm really speaking from the chaplaincy work at the county jail more than specifically my own Quaker tradition. So I just want to specify that.
Yeah.
I think the biggest reason I want to speak to this is what I heard most often in the jail from people is, I just thought I was going crazy, quote unquote. People aren't used to the, I'll say, ping pong of emotion of, anger, guilt, loneliness, grief, depression. I mean, the sadness followed by the sleep disruption, the inability to focus, sometimes the, lack of an appetite. It affects us in our thoughts, it affects us in our emotions, it affects us in our bodies. And oftentimes, people don't even understand that's how it impacts us and how it manifests. And so for me, if nothing else, I just want people to know if they're experiencing those things, that's normal, they're human. And obviously there's a time and a place to reach out and get professional help. But at first, this is just what this is just how it affects us as human beings. And so in regards to how do I understand the role of grieving, grief is all those symptoms that I, identified.
Mm-hmm.
Mourning is when we really kind of publicly do it. But adapting to loss is, it's a process, and it doesn't happen overnight. And I think that accompaniment, which we usually look to an outside person, also to in our prayer life for those in religious traditions, in regards to knowing that we're not alone from a higher being. But there's also an aspect of, I think also in grieving, it really helps for people to understand accompaniment as also accompanying themselves. And possibly we don't expect people to function when they have a broken leg, but somehow we often expect ourselves to function even when we're grieving. And the fact is, we can't.
Right.
So just like we give ourselves time to rehabilitate when we have that broken leg, we need to be able to give ourselves time.
Mm-hmm.
Whether we do or not, oftentimes the body just takes time, or the mind, or however you want to think of it. But I think that that's really just those preoccupation, the absent-minded behavior, all of those things are just really part of it. And I think I'll let someone else take it from there. But
Reverend Hoffman, do you want to jump in and expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, that was great. I was really enjoying what you had to say, Shannon. Thank you very much. So, I think what I wanted to first say was, if you've lost someone, the people that are listening, if you lost someone during this time or someone recently, I just want to say I'm sorry, and it hurts, and grief hurts. And the other thing I want to say is, if you've lost someone during this pandemic, I'm really sorry too, because it's a really strange time to lose someone. I just got off the phone with someone who wasn't able to talk to their loved one who was in the hospital, wasn't able to visit them for 3 weeks because of the pandemic. And finally, they were able to get in and see their spouse, and just how painful that was. And another person I spoke with that wasn't able to be there when their mom died, because they were in a skilled nursing facility that had a full lockdown. And so there's layers of grief with that. You're mourning the loss of your mom, and you're mourning the loss of the fact that you couldn't hold your mom's hand when she was passing away. And so I just want to say to anyone who's experiencing that, I'm really sorry. And that's hard, and that's difficult, and just adds to the sense of grief. And then I loved what Shannon shared about some of the things about grief, about we feel kind of crazy in the midst of grief in a way. And yet, as Shannon was saying, it's normal. That's what grief is. I personally experienced, my father passed away when I was 23, but he got cancer when I was 13. And so I lived for 9 years in this sense of grief, as I knew he was getting closer, and on and off with cancer, and then finally passed away. And I'm going to tell you a piece of my story, just because it adds to my perspective, coming from a Christian perspective. Was that I was praying to God that my dad would get better, and he kept getting worse. And then I would pray to God that my dad, this like 13-year-old to 19-year-old, I prayed my dad would not suffer, at least, because I knew he was going to die. And then my dad suffered. And I've done hospice work for 13 years, and I've only seen one other patient suffer like my dad. It went to his brain, he had convulsions, and it was horrible. And so as a Christian, I had to deal with the loss of my dad, but I was also dealing with the fact that I was just really angry at God. And why would God allow this? And especially the suffering. And it took me a while. And so what I would say is that a normal part of grief is you often feel like I felt like this. You're in a cloud, or you're in this fog, and life often feels like there's no color. And I added to that kind of the red of rage. I was so angry. And for me in my Christian tradition, I was still I really loved God. I was very close to God, and yet I was really angry at God. And for me, what was transforming was I felt like God held me from my tradition and cared for me, even when I was raging at that God. And that was all part of my working through my grief. And I came out on the other side feeling like, yeah, God loved me and God mourned as I mourned. And God didn't want this to happen as much as I didn't want this to happen to my dad. And I felt God's embrace and eventually became a pastor. But I share that all with you because grief is complicated. And I share that with you because there was a sense where there was this cloud for a year and a half kind of around me. And then all of a sudden, I started to see color again. And I started to feel like the fog was lifted. But when I was in the middle of it, I never thought that fog was going to lift. It was just there. And so my encouragement to us is that we work through grief by feeling our grief and finding ways to feel it. And so I went through counseling and journaling and talking with friends, and I did a road trip, and there's different things you can do, and we'll talk more about that.
Yeah, and I think that is a really it's very powerful comment on, especially coming from a fog into things back into color, because we will get to the other side of this, but we need help doing that and compassion from those around us through this. And
right.
maybe I'll circle back to you as we get to kind of that next question to dig deeper into it. Maybe
I say
could
one
hear
more thing?
Oh yes, please.
Can I say one more thing?
Yes.
Just that part of why I shared all that darkness was when I work with people often, because of their faith tradition, they often say, oh, I have faith, I have hope, I'm not sad. And it's like, no, you're mourning and missing that person, even if you believe in heaven or an afterlife. And there's this weird juxtaposition of holding on to hope that someday we'll see them again, but we miss them in our daily life now. And you can feel that even if you're a person of strong faith. And so that's kind of what I wanted to end with. So now you can go to someone else, but just that sense of feeling both.
Yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off on that. I think that's a very powerful way to round that out. Rabbi, do you have more to add on that subject? I'm sure you do.
Uh-oh. So first, I just want to say, Pastor Hoffman, thank you so much for sharing your own personal experience. I think it's really important for us all to hear our stories. Judaism really has a lot to say about grief. First, I want to just say that it's my belief that our grief is really an expression of our love, that connection, that the grieving process is part of the ways in which we loved the people who have died. Even in the complicated love parts, even when we've been hurt or whatever has happened in the relationships, I think that grief is an expression of the connection. Mm-hmm. Judaism really looks at grief as a journey, I would say, and there's a lot of psycho-spiritual kind of pathways that I'd like to think of them as anchors, where, when somebody dies, the idea, and this has been a real challenge, of course, during this crazy time, the idea is to have somebody buried as soon as possible. It's a Jewish practice to do as least intervention in terms of how we take care of a person's body after they've died. And in fact, the only job of the people who have suffered the death of a loved one is to plan for their, burial and funeral. So they're not obligated to anything else. And then we have basically a burial, the preparation of the body, which I mentioned earlier, a burial, and in fact, actually, even before the burial, people do sit guarding the body in normal times. Right now, that's not happening at all, actually. Funeral homes are responsible for all of that. Our groups of people that usually would take care of our loved ones' bodies are not doing that. But we would bury somebody as soon as we can. And then at the funeral, people would gather together, which they're not doing, although obviously some people are doing 10 feet apart or in cars. People are working with that immediate desire to move to that stage of grief where someone is actually placed in the ground. And then there's a week where traditionally you would go home to the house, you would light a candle, a Shiva candle. Shiva comes from the word Shiva, which means a week. And this beautiful, you'd recite a beautiful piece of Semmes, which is the flame of the divine is the soul of the person. And that candle, when my father died, every time I passed the candle in my house, I would feel his flame of his spirit flickering, and I'd be able to see it there. And then there's the week long, and in tradition, we would gather together and share stories and say prayers. I've done probably 2 Shiva Zoom meetings so far, and one of our other rabbis did another one so that people could be together. And I know there's Zoom funerals going on all over the country for all of our traditions, many of our traditions. And then there's a month-long period of mourning where things would shift again. And then every year at the time of the person's death, we observe the anniversary of their death. And some people, a lot of people obviously are, postponing the memorial services for later on, a celebration of life, but people still are thinking about, when is it that my loved one is buried? What does that mean to have a year go by? Traditionally, there would be the unveiling of the grave marker in a year, 11 months to a year. And so people would gather again at the cemetery, check in. What does this mean? Where are we in a different place? And God willing, this next time around, this next year, for those folks who have loved ones who've died, they will be able to gather to do that important thing. I was also thinking a lot while Pastor Hoffman was sharing about some of our texts that give us some comfort. So in Jewish tradition, it's customary to read Psalms, which are not all beautiful, glorifying God pieces of sacred text. They're railing against God. Why have you forsaken me? Where are you, God? I'm calling on you from the narrow places. Please reveal yourself to me. There's the book of Job, which Job, suffers so much loss in his life and can't understand it at all. So I think that what our faith traditions are telling us in those texts is this is the human condition. We lose people when they die. We feel a great amount of grief. We have some anchors that can help us process that. And especially now, since so many of the anchors are, virtual, really, we need to figure out ways to do that. One last thing I want to say, I mentioned the 7-day period of mourning. Tradition is to wear a ribbon or to cut one's clothing at the funeral. And so I still think it's important for people, if they can, after a person has died in Jewish tradition, to tear the ribbon or tear a piece of clothing, which symbolizes the tearing in the heart, and to wear it. Right? Mm-hmm. Not a lot of us are going out and seeing each other, but I will tell you that I've seen people out and about, over time wearing a ribbon, and I know that identifies them outwardly as a mourner. So there's different kind of anchors, some of which I think we can still practice in our Jewish communities that will help us kind of have some road marks. Last thing I guess I want to say is I've always, whenever I've preached about death and grief, I always say it's not a straight line. Time doesn't heal. Right? It's not like you go forward. It's a windy road. It keeps curving around. And I think that our sacred texts reveal that to us as well. So, a lot more to say, but I think I'll stop for now.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. I want to add here, I saw a note come up from one of our people who are listening out there. Lenore writes, when my son died 1 year ago last week, it was comforting to have the parents' grief support provided by Rabbi Paula and the group she formed to help work us through our pain. I'd like to know if there are plans for any grief work in the future. So let's touch on that when we circle back around. Yeah, unless you'd like to comment on that now.
Well, I just want to say we've had a few bereavement groups here at Temple Bethel. The first one that we had was in cooperation with a wonderful chaplain from Hospice. So I really want to encourage other communities to call on Hospice. I co-facilitated that group for people who had partners who died. And this other group that Lenore is referring to was facilitated by two wonderful psychotherapists with a lot of background in loss, and it was for people whose children had died. So yeah, there will be more for sure, and I want to encourage other faith communities to collaborate with hospice in that way.
Thank you. And Suzanne, thank you for being patient. You have a couple religions to touch on and different traditions you could probably share with us as well. So I'd love to hear from you. Oops, we're still on mute. Let me see if we can unmute you here. Hold on, Suzanne. We asked the facilitator to unmute.
I can.
Suzanne. There we go. We got her.
Well, building on what Pastor Hoffman said and Senior Rabbi Paula said, certainly I don't think we can stress enough that grieving in the instance of someone's death is an expression of the connection the griever had to the person who was living. And of course, Derek, talked earlier about the kinds of griefs we experience when our lives change, and we're certainly grieving for the old lives that we had. Some people are even celebrating that they don't have to do those old lives, right. But it's particularly profound loss for people coming to the transitions in their lives, such as schools ending. My son has had to postpone his marriage. My goddaughter has had to postpone her marriage. And what does that mean when you can't marry because people can't gather? Of course, some people are doing that anyway, but these were not people who, they really wanted all those witnesses there. It was a long, hard decision in each case to marry, and so they want the people who've accompanied them on that journey of loving one another to be present when they joined. And so the losses there are huge, and the uncertainty causes grief too, I think. People don't really know when they're going to be able to reschedule things, and they don't know when they're going to be able to gather together to grieve in the case of the death of someone. And certainly I have not been working in the hospital the last 4 weeks, but I know that people have died in hospitals with only people they met in the last 12 hours with them. And those people who have been with them, the staff of the hospitals, are also experiencing profound grief at what their lives have brought to them, which they didn't get trained for that, you know? Yeah. And so that's a huge change too. There are no experts in any of this. I think anyone who's studied grieving or counseled people grieving knows that every person experiences loss in a different way. And that doesn't, however, mean that we're alone, unless we choose to be. And all of our faiths invite us to seek others who believe as we do to support us in loss. We join to sing, we join to pray together, we join to dance and to create. And in Buddhism, people join to meditate with one another. And there's a tradition in the Christian culture, and as well in monastic culture, there's the withdrawing from the world to practice, and there's the going into the world of the others to practice. And this has been a period, the last 6 weeks, where people have been invited to go inward, and that can be very painful. But Buddhism teaches us to be with the anguish and the pain, not to run away from it, but not to future imagine either, but to remain in the present. And the way we remain in the present is to breathe and to chant, if that's what we do, and to find a personal way through using our breath to take us there. So I think and what others have said about sharing stories, it's really important. And those things can be done whether we're physically with each other or not. But one of the things that occurred to me when I was reflecting on what to say today is that the last 50 years in the United States has been a time of more openness about death and more acknowledgement that death happens. With the birth movement came the hospice movement, and that more awareness that we can accompany one another through death as we accompany people through birth. And so people nowadays are really experiencing the loss of the new freedom to be with people when they die. And when people say, I wasn't able to be with my loved one because we weren't allowed, I know that's a profound pain, but I'm reminded of the historical awareness that in every war anyone's experienced, deaths have taken place at a distance, at a time we're not sure when they're taking place, in ways that we don't know exactly how they happened. And people have still been able to grieve, mourn, and practice rituals to help them through that profound pain of not being present when life leaves their loved one.
Thank you. And I think the story, like several of you touched on this, how people are grieving right now and they're feeling isolated, right? I know I have a good friend whose mother passed away here in town, and family members and siblings could not come out to Santa Cruz to grieve. And they're separated by miles in distance, and they're each going through it in their own way. And so it's a very tough time. And so many of you said how sorry you are for people that are going through this right now, because it's a really unique time in history. But to your point, Suzanne, people have experienced it in wars and other ways throughout time where that has occurred, and you've had to grieve in different ways. So I'm going to go on to the next question, which is, how can we cope and find comfort, which is often sought through community activities such as memorial services or celebrations of life, where friends and family come together to share food and stories of those they've lost. There are people in our community right now who aren't able to do that, like I mentioned. And what do they do? Is there a practice or story from your faith tradition or bereavement experience to help someone who is having to grieve in isolation? Anything you'd share with them? And I'll start with Reverend Hoffman, and then I saw Shannon raise her hand, and we'll go around. I know everyone, yes, would like to touch on this. So we'll just kind of go through. Why don't we start with Dan and then work our way around?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think for me, when I was thinking about grief, the short answer is the path to healing for grief is to grieve, is to feel it, and to express what's inside. And one of the things I was reading about said that, this is the one time in your life when you get to have a very special relationship with that loved one, where you really think about them and what you appreciate about them and feel about them and miss them. And in our culture, we often want to run away from those hard feelings, but if we could embrace that as a special, difficult, but special season to really embrace that loved one. Again, Dr. Earl Groman states, grief is not a disorder, a disease, or a sign of weakness. It's an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity. It's the price you pay for love. And the only cure for grief is to grieve. And so, you often hear the words, funerals are for the living, and saying, and it's true. And yet I feel like in this time of sheltering in, a lot of people have been kind of ripped off of having that funeral that they would normally think of that they need to grieve. So I kind of looked up some things that people are doing nowadays. And I mean, let's get creative. Let's go for it. I mean, we've got an artist here, and I can't wait to hear what she has to say. But let's get creative. And what are some things we can do? You could all get on Zoom and everyone, at the same time and share stories and memories and hold up pictures, and you could do that. Or if you're not technologically savvy at all, write down the 10, 15, 20 people that are closest to you that knew this person, and take a couple days and have a phone call funeral and just talk with each of those people, and share and cry and tell stories. So just another way you can do it. I heard there's a couple of online things you can do, something called LifeWeb 360, which offers friends and family a special online place to remember people. I think everyone can kind of post. Another one called Gathering Us or Reimagine. And I think, so get creative. And I guess the last thing I wanted to say was, grief is not weakness.
Mm-hmm.
The most courageous thing we can ever do is to love someone with all our heart. And love takes courage. And grief takes courage. And grief is not weakness. So let yourself grieve. Let yourself feel. And consequently, let yourself heal. So let's get creative.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Love that, Dan. Thank you. Shannon, did you want to add to that? I saw you raise your hand.
Yes, and also thank you, Reverend Hoffman. That was wonderful. I was actually already going to launch the theme of creative, so I'll just add one more. There's no point in repeating what he's already said, but I was talking with a student. I forgot to actually introduce myself that I'm a professor. I have a PhD in practical theology, which includes all of the things we're talking about. But I was talking with a student last week, and they're serving as an intern right now in a congregation, and they've started putting together grief kits and delivering these grief kits to different members of the congregation in order for them to have, a reading and some kind of, she's been personalizing them for those people. But I think that that's something that members of congregations usually know each other, and there's someone, I think that any kind of showing of care that could come in a form of a grief kit, but also, like Reverend Hoffman mentioned, it can come in the form of what you appreciate most about the person who passed away. That might be on a card rather than something spoken. In one of the Quaker things that we do in a memorial is to have people spontaneously just stand up and share things about the person who's passed that they were most touched by or learned from or appreciated or loved. And I think that we still just need to record those and make sure that that we're sharing those. And grief kits and the other online formats are ways to do that. But I also think that, there's lots more, obviously, with whether it's art or song. But I do want to say, even though Quakers don't have, like cantors, a part of music as part of integral into every service, I do think that music in particular, I haven't been a part of Threshold Choir, but I have been singing for people crossing over for 25 years. And I can say that my experience from having done that is that the singing is still important to do for the loved one after they've crossed, and can be done at home in the privacy of one's own home for as long as one feels that that's appropriate. And that there's in that place of spiritually singing and holding and love those who are transitioning, there's I'll say a gift that we receive as well when we do that. Not just a spiritual gift in a sense of union with them, but also a sense of union with the mystery of cycles and that which is beyond our comprehension. And that singing is something so often in our world that we've kind of commodified or commercialized or, delegated to the realm of children. And we haven't embraced song as one of the most profound, I'll say, tools to truly use in times of grief and holding our loved ones. So
that's a beautiful and very true. And I saw Suzanne nodding her head there. Yeah. Do you want to add on to that, and then I'll go over to Rabbi Paula?
Thank you. One of the experiences we have in the Threshold Choir is it's an international organization of women, and now men have joined too. And we have over 350 songs that we all study in our small groups and learn to sing a cappella. And when we gather in large groups, we sing them, and that's very profound. But the purpose of the songs or chants is to use at bedsides. And what we found over the course of using these songs at bedsides is that certain songs, I really loved what Shannon said about continuing to sing after the person's passed, because certain songs, when I sing them, I remember singing them as someone has passed. And the songs are enriched, and I, of course, am enriched. And I hope that others listening are. But there's a profound connection through our voices and our shared and blended voices that's huge. And I'd like to highlight a Celtic practice at dying called keening. Some of you may have heard of it, but it is the gathering of those who are grieving in a dark place and crying out together, a sort of ancient Alexander technique, if you will. And this practice of keening has great power and profound ability to move the emotions out of the body and out into the world and shared, of course. I don't know if keening is done on Zoom, but it could be. And I really invite the people attending today to explore that as something, if it appeals to them from a Celtic tradition, to consider keening. And as far as material and artistic responses to grief, I lost a friend last summer, and I wasn't able to be with him when he died. And I was asked to do his memorial, but the person who asked me has never called me to make a date. And he was a dear friend of mine, this man. And I realized that I had to grieve him in my own way. So I gathered all of the letters that we had written, and we had actually physically written letters, and the photographs I had of him, and an article about something that he loved very much. And I just put all those material things into on my desk and looked at them and arranged them. And that simple act of arranging them helped me to grieve and to remember James in a way that was meaningful to me. People used to make scrapbooks, memorial books. That bookmaking is something people can do. We, in this electronic age, we can make slideshows. Some of the most lovely funerals I've been to have included a video slideshow of photographs from the person's life, and overlaying with music and choosing music that was meaningful to that person or the time they lived in. And all of those are available to us now, as well as letter writing. It's one thing to send a Facebook note saying sorry for your loss, but it's another thing to get out a piece of paper and write a letter, because the grieving person can hold that physical letter in their hands and see the person, the loved one's name written on a piece of paper by somebody else, and touch it. And there's something, even if we can't touch one another, we can touch something they touched or something someone else touched. And it's there to be read whenever I want to pick it up. So I think that's That's profound too.
That's beautiful, because each of you have been talking about things that are, and they're very creative, and they're what you can do right now in this situation, which is so challenging. Rabbi Paula, would you care to add on to that? I would love to hear from you too.
Thank you. So I'd love to just take a step back for a moment to acknowledge something about our collective grief. And I'm really very moved by all of the sharings in terms of creativity and how we mourn our personal losses. And I think the way that I have begun to understand grief is that it's compounding, meaning that when someone dies who we love and then another person dies, that original grief can be reopened. And I want to name that. I don't know how many of us are reading the paper these days or listening to the news stories, but we are being exposed to so many individual stories of death. Like if we look at numbers, that's one thing. But I think there are many, many stories that are surfacing now of individual people who've died, their lives, their work, healthcare workers, people who are working in grocery stores, all of the individual people. There's a beautiful poem written by an Israeli poet, Zelda. Each of us has a name given to us by our birth, given to us by our work, personalizing each individual life. So I think it's important just to kind of understand that this collective grief is huge right now, that, all we have to do is open our eyes and we're being exposed to this. Of course, as we've said, the fact that we can't do what we normally do is making things more challenging. There's another piece of this that I think I have to name for myself, that I don't know if other people have been feeling this. Part of what I think is happening now is that some of my grief is being laced with anger and frustration. And I have to name that because I'm so emotionally worked up at times about how things have been mishandled and how politics have entered into the way in which some of the unnecessary loss has been occurring in our country. So we are also, I think, being exposed to the grief that is happening in terms of recognizing the inequality in our country. So there's so much just naming that we have individual lives of people who've lost, and then there's also the other layers that are on top of that grief. And then I think there's another piece of grief, which is anticipatory grief, meaning that we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to come, right? So there's so much right now, and there are these waves of grief. And for me, as has been mentioned before, what's so important is to monitor how much I'm taking in of the collective grief, and to be able to find ways to care for myself, whether that's through song, which for me is also very, very important, whether it's through writing to my loved ones, whether it's to a daily phone call with my mother, who's, 87, as we say, nothing should happen to her whenever we say somebody's age, to be able to connect, to be able to stay in touch and to be able to value what is precious now, what is precious. How do we value that as a balm for all of the rest of what we're carrying right now? And so, we've been talking about Zoom, we've been talking about writing stories, we've been talking about music, we've been talking about art. I have to say there's something else that I feel like is going on right now, which is the recognition that this time is precious, meaning life is a gift. If we don't know that now, I think if we didn't know it before, I think we know it now. We have someone in our community who was just re-diagnosed with a very serious cancer. And just this morning, this couple did a 10-year anniversary renewal of their wedding vows on Zoom with their children there. Of course, the last comment was, "Can I go play now?" But it was beautiful. And, we're all on Zoom sobbing because here's this family who's been through so much, and another treatment cycle is going to happen, and the treatment's going to happen alone in a hospital with nobody else there. And so that's the anticipatory grief, right? But it's happening all over the place. It's happening all over the place. And so the more we can connect, whether it's through the phone call, through the Zoom, in Jewish tradition, we also have a practice of giving charity, giving tzedakah, what we call it, which is righteous giving, in memory of someone who's died. So if there's a loss, plant a tree. right? Make a donation to an organization that was important to that person and send a note to the family to say, I've contributed to X, Y, or Z, a food pantry, or I've wanted to make this person's life values continue, because I think that's what's so important too. In the process of grief, how do we embody the spirit of the person who's died so that their values continue? And that's a hopeful way of looking at grief. So it's such a broad, expansive realm of possibilities. We have another member who both grandparents died within the last 2 weeks on the East Coast, two from the same family. And normally they would fly out there for the funeral. This is a very, observant family. And so they've had to do everything on Zoom, and they have, right? So, life is continuing, death is continuing. There's collective grief. There's, all of the emotions that we're having. I do think one piece for me has been to go into nature. That's been really important for me to get regrounded, to be able to release some of the, frustration and some of the exposure to what's happening in our country, emotionally, spiritually, psychospiritually, and to be able to release that into nature, which, if you can get to the beach before 11, these days. But seriously, the ocean, to me, is also a place of great cleansing. Water in many of our spiritual traditions is a place where we're able to find a sense of hope and renewal. So I think I'll stop there. But we do still have options, and I think we need to really be exploring all of the ones that we're able to find now.
I agree with that, and it's so it is so neat that we're at least in a place right now where we have technology as an option to help us connect with people in ways we couldn't before. Even this discussion right now, the fact it's happening in this way, thank goodness we have that as an option. And I do want to share a couple comments that we have from the audience real quick that I wanted to share out. One was to Pastor Dan, and he says, I know it's hard, but we can never forget our loved ones, and they will always remind us and be in our heart. And someone else is thanking us for encouraging her to grieve and feel the range of emotions, because I think feeling right now, it's easy to push these things down, but to experiencing them and let them come through you, and like you said, take them out into nature, release that. But and then someone also notes that we've been doing the howling at night at 8 o'clock, and keening could be part of what that is. It's what happens when people both individually and collectively fail to grieve, right? So going out there, it is a neat experience every evening to celebrate our first responders and people that are helping out there in the world right now. So I'm worried we're going to run out of time, and I'm loving this so much. I could spend all afternoon with you guys, and I'm sure our everyone out there could as well. The next question, I think we may have already kind of answered this, unless someone wants to expand on a little bit more. Raise your hand if you do. How can friends and family or even strangers help those experiencing grief and loss while remaining physically distant? We've talked about that a little bit. Does anyone have anything that they wanted to add to that we haven't touched on yet? Suzanne? Yeah.
In doing my research for this, I did find something for the future. It can't be done right now, but there have been mothers in 2006, there was a film called Motherland, and it's a documentary about 5 mothers who'd lost their children and who traveled together in collective mourning. And it inspired a project called Project Grace, which is a grief therapy program. This was all in California, and it was particularly focused on Hispanic grievers. And I think that's an important opportunity for people to practice solidarity, even with strangers, and because there are several wonderful Buddhist stories about how grieving is a great universal. There is a woman who lost her son, went to the Buddha and asked him to bring her son back to life. And the Buddha said to her, go into your village and go to every house and find a mustard seed from someone who has not experienced a loss. And so the woman went back to her village. She knocked on every door, but no person could give her a mustard seed because everyone had experienced a loss. So she went back and she told the Buddha, and he said, now you've had your compassion opened in this great way. And that's a Buddhist teaching about what we do with our grieving. We understand that everybody's hurting somehow. And that builds on what Rabbi Paula said about the social anguish and the different layers of pain that the nations are experiencing and that different groups are experiencing. And no one gets out without loss.
Can I add a question to that came up from one of our members here? Rebecca writes, for 42 years, I've been grieving the loss of my stillborn son. In Catholicism, stillborn babies do not go on to heaven and be with God because they were not baptized to absolve them from original sin. What are your thoughts about stillborn babies and grieving? Anyone want to comment on that? Or Suzanne, do you want to continue? Rabbi Paula, go ahead, yeah. Oops, we lost Rabbi Paula. Let's get your mic back on there.
Unmute.
There we go.
There we go. I can't respond from a point of view of Catholicism, but we have done rituals. There have been rituals that we've done, some of which were created, because there hadn't been traditional rituals. I think, this opens up a whole question of what do we do for situations that are not prescribed in our tradition. Your grief for your stillborn child must be, incredible. I can't only imagine how, after all these years, that's still with you. And I'm so sorry for that loss, because I've been with people who have had that happen. We have a family where their twins were stillborn, and every year at the anniversary of their death, they say a mourner's prayer. We have a tradition of the mourner's prayer on the anniversary of death. And every year on the anniversary, when these two little baby twins were stillborn, had to be birthed, they say a prayer, and we stand with them to say that prayer. And so I think it's really important to find ways to mark that loss, whether it's a new ritual that you would have, be able to create with friends or family, or something that you mark the anniversary of when that happened for you. Just light a candle, say a prayer of memory, some way that you can mark that, because I think it's really important to be able to visit that grief. And, the anniversary of the death would be a time when you might be able to do that. We have been doing, since we've been sheltering in place, every Friday afternoon, we have a call for those who want to recite the prayer of mourning, early evening, 5:30, 5:45, 6 o'clock, where we say the prayer together. Those who want to get on a Zoom call with me say the prayer together, and we have recorded services later for the Sabbath or Zoom services, but every Friday, 5:45 or so, people get on and they say the mourner's prayer together according to our tradition. And what's been interesting about that is that we've had people coming from siblings coming to say the prayer together who have not been together in years to be able to do it. So, one woman here who has a brother in Marin, and they got on together, and it had been, 5 years since they'd been in the same place to say this prayer for their father. So there's ways in which, being in this new virtual world, people are connecting differently, and there's some ways in which that's been a blessing. So for the two of them to be able to say that prayer together for their father, who had died some time ago, for the first time in a long time, was actually very powerful for them. So I think that it's important to, remember the grief and mark it in some profound way. And again, I'm so sorry for your loss. And a stillborn child is a death. It is something to grieve for. And so I pray that you find a way to be able to mark that and remember that. I also wanted to just add quickly that people, I'm forgetting now who said it, maybe it was you, Pastor Hoffman, that we talk now more about death than ever before. Maybe it was you, Suzanne. Baby boomers don't do anything quietly. That was one of the things that I had heard. So we're not going to go silently into the night. We're going to be talking about death. And there's a beautiful project that Stanford Hospital put together called the Conversation Project, which encourages people to talk about death and dying more. And I know Hospice has been really amazing in terms of helping people make plans for their own death. And we have, actually through Temple Bethel, we have Holly Blue Hawkins, who's been amazing. She's been leading Kavod conversations about death. You can go on our website and find it. But there are so many ways in which people now are able to find resources online during this time when we're home more, to read and to engage and to watch. You know, of course, we all know Being Mortal was such an important piece that came out by Atul Gawande, and there's a movie that was created off of the book. And so I know I'm heading into the next topic of conversation, but we have a lot of resources where we can find creative ideas and information and companionship in this.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll go to Dan, and I wanted to add to what you said about marking or traditions in marking. My wife's sister lost 2 twins in utero, and you know, they had ways. I mean, they went through a burial with the children, and the father every year hikes to one of the peaks in California and plants these 2 little flags, you know, for the children, and it's just a touching way for them to mark that loss and remember them. And so I encourage you. I thank you for saying that. Reverend Hoffman, yes, please.
I'd love to just address the theological question she put behind that, which was, you know, in a Catholic tradition, a stillborn wouldn't be in heaven. And being raised Catholic and then being a Christian, which is the Catholic part of the Catholic tradition is Christianity. And first of all, it depends on which priest you talk to. I mean, they all have different opinions, and the stance is always changing. So that, and then if you just look at Scripture alone, God is love. It says in Scripture, and so God is not going to. We're not going to be more loving than God. God is the essence of love and goodness and grace and kindness. So if you're screaming out at the fact that this stillborn is not going to be in heaven, then God is screaming out even more, saying, no, this stillborn will be in heaven. Because God is love. And that's the foundation of the Christian faith and the Catholic faith. And all theology has to go back to that before you decide what's going to happen. Love enables us to love our neighbor and forgive our neighbor. And we have a God who's, you know, in the Christian tradition, crazy enough to walk on this earth and die for us, to show his love for us, to open the gates of heaven. So I just had to say that.
Thank you for saying that, Dan. I imagine that means the world to Rebecca out there.
Give some comfort there. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to ask another question from our group out there. They thank you guys for all your comments and insights, and they're grieving the loss of 2.5 years ago of her husband of 38 years, but she's found with the pandemic overwhelmed, and she's had to put that grief on a back burner. She feels like it's going to come back to haunt her or bite her at some point, that she has buried this and pushed it down. Have you heard of other people in this situation, and is it a common reaction to do that with this stress in the world? Is it something else you're seeing happening, and any recommendations for her? Anyone want to raise your hand, and I'll. Yeah, okay. Suzanne, and then I'll go to Paula, Rabbi.
I would say that it's perfectly natural to suspend active grieving for a period of time and to be gentle with myself. I allow myself to do that when I have to. I experience grief all the time. There's a lot of, I encounter death often. And I have set aside hours in the day and days of the week to show up for my grieving and invite it to come in. There are various ways to prime the pump listen to a certain piece of music, sit on a rock and look out at the sea, read a letter. I keep a book with all the names of those who've died in my life and read it at those times as a ritual of remembrance. But I wouldn't worry about burying a grief, because grief has its own life and it will come back in ways that it needs to come back. And sometimes it will come back in ways of being compassionate to others. So I think what the person who's asked the question is saying, that the stress of the COVID-19 response is so much that the person feels sidetracked from the process of active grieving, but it's not really a track, it's kind of a wandering path, and will allow it, just like water flowing downhill, grief goes where it needs to go, and it will come back, but it will be transformed because time has happened, and it will be different, but it will still be where it needs to be when it needs to be. And whatever gave you comfort in being with your husband, and I would imagine that, I know I miss people that I want to talk to about this, and they're gone. I can't talk to them about it. And on the other hand, I'm grateful they don't have to see this. So I don't know if that's an answer or helpful, but grief has its own weight and momentum, and we don't have to be afraid of it.
I think that's probably very helpful. Yeah. Rabbi, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say that I really love what you said, Suzanne. I think that's very, very beautiful. In Jewish tradition, we study in the memory of people who we've loved and who have died, and to carve out some time, maybe to just read a poem, or as you said, listen to some music, and to make that something that, you know, if you feel like you want to touch base with your grief, you do set aside some time to do that. I think part of why grief might be a difficult thing to feel at this time is just that sense of overwhelm. And if we open the door, maybe it'll come rushing in and just take us away, as a wave might take us away. But if we're able to like find some kind of regular invitation, open the window, don't worry about the door, you know what I mean? Like open the window and just see, you know, who's there, how is your husband appearing to you in this particular moment? Because I know with my own grief, different sides of people surface in different times, depending upon what I'm thinking about or what I'm sitting with. And, you know, we do have a practice where people go to cemeteries and meditate. In Buddhist tradition, I know for sure. In Jewish tradition, people do visit, you know, their loved ones at the cemetery, which we're not really doing much these days, although we do have a family who had a young man who died, and they walk to the cemetery, you know, every day. This father walks every day to go visit the grave by himself, or maybe with his wife, or, you know, so there are those ways in which our loved ones, we can approach them in that sense. I think there's also another piece here that I'm starting to wonder about, whether it's about our loved ones, meaning our husbands, our partners, our wives, you know, anybody, our children, to think about them shining down on us from wherever they are. That there's a concept in Jewish tradition called the merit of our ancestors. And sometimes people think about the ones who've come before us, meaning our elders. But I think that at this particular moment, the veil may be much thinner than usual, certainly when holidays come around. So for Passover and Easter and Ramadan and, you know, times when we celebrate the Buddha, that veil can be very thin. And to take that opportunity to just really, what was it like when I sat around the Passover table with my loved one? You know, what is it like when, you know, we would break fast together for Ramadan and our loved ones who are no longer alive in their bodies are present with us? So to really explore it when that veil is thin. But for sure, if it feels like it's overwhelming, carve out certain time, to do that as Suzanne was recommending.
Yes. And Reverend Hoffman, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to add, I love what both of you said, Rabbi Paula and Shannon, or Suzanne. Often when people think of hospice, they think of helping people to live well until they die. And a lot of people don't know that there's a full bereavement department in every hospice, and it's free to the community. And there's grief groups and literature and counselors waiting to help. And so I encourage people to reach out to their local hospice. I work for CCVNA and hospice, but every hospice has it. And we just started doing virtual groups. We always had in-person groups, but we just started doing virtual groups. And so you can call your local hospice or CCVNA and hospice, and it gives you a weekly place. Because a part of grief is sharing the story of your loved one. And the grief group gives you a place to share that story and to hear other people's stories, and to also, I think, normalize your grief. Because you hear these other people that are like, I was in the freezer section and I saw their favorite pasta and I broke down, and it just helps you realize, I did the same thing with the bananas, or whatever. So it just helps normalize and gives you a community to walk through grief with. And
Right.
so I highly recommend those grief groups. I used to lead them, and we have some really good people leading them at hospice. So I wanted to say that. And then I want to say one other thing, which was when people are grieving, sometimes they're so overwhelmed, they can't reach out for help. And so I want to say to you, those of you that are listening that are friends of people that are grieving and wondering how to help them, when they say they're okay, keep asking. Or when you haven't heard from them from a while, keep checking in. And when you ask if they want anything and they say no, make suggestions of what you can do for them. Because they're so overwhelmed, they can't even think sometimes of what they need. And encourage them to take care of themselves and be gentle to themselves. So that's it.
That's great. I think, and I think we all have to remember that right now. It's that compassion for others out there in the world. I mean, we wake up in the morning in our house, and I've got 2 teenage daughters here, and it's having compassion for how we're each feeling. We call it feeling COVID-y. You wake up, maybe you read too much news, maybe you're missing something in particular, you're just down, and you can tell. Having compassion for that person, saying I love you, and just letting them go through it and feel it. This is for everyone. I'm going to start with Shannon because we haven't heard from Shannon in a while. As a former elder and it may be one of our last questions if anyone time goes here. I do want to get to the books and resources before we finish today. So let's do this, and then let's get to books and resources. As a former elder and former deacon, friends of many different faiths often turn to me. Death is universal. How can I be universal with sensitive advice to everyone?
I have 2 sides of a coin for that. Advice can be problematic. So I'll take it in the positive sense. I think that most hospice chaplains are trained in I forgive you, forgive me, thank you, I love you, goodbye. So that's the advice that I think is universal, to have honorable closure. But the other side of that, I'll lead it as a text, going into resources. I put online, and I know the library has this, which is called the SALT acronym: see them, allow them, listen to them, trust them. And I think oftentimes people try to give advice or to fix, and that's not helpful. And so I just, I hope that you will go on to the library and you can access this. This was created, actually, I will quickly share this. The woman who became a grief counselor and has written multiple books, when she was 11 years old, her best friend was kidnapped and murdered. And out of that horrible tragedy and that heinous act, because she didn't get people truly seeing her and listening to her and allowing her and trusting her, she is the one who came up with this for others of how to be present for. And so it really I only share the story because I want people to know that this is from a place of a person who knew what it was like to get the wrong kind of advice. And so this is a great resource. And I also listed one of her books on the site. And also because we had a question earlier, and excuse me, that's why I left my seat for a moment. I had to go over to my other shelf. I'm sure there's more than just this, but this is what a program that I had to go through. Resolve through sharing is bereavement materials, but specifically regarding perinatal death. And when I did my CPE, which is Clinical Pastoral Education internship, when I did my CPE internship, I was in Arkansas, in a place of great poverty, and stillborn deaths. Like Rabbi Paula brought up in regards to systemic injustice and showing in the statistics. I mean, we hear the mortality rates for the economically disadvantaged are always higher, but I had never experienced so much perinatal death in my life, serving the women's unit in that particular facility. And I can't say enough for that it is recognized as a very, more sensitive, not to diminish anyone's other's grief, but perinatal death is a category of its own, and demands attention, and I would say more skill than other grief. And I just really want people to be able to know that that exists and to please look for that. And I think that I'll let someone take it from there with other resources. But thank you, because those are important for people to know about.
Thank you for sharing those. Let's go through and go around the horn here. What other resources would you like to recommend to people right now around grief and loss that you think might be helpful that we haven't talked about? And our facilitators can share that out after the discussion. My understanding, they're also, for people listening out there, there's going to be they're doing 4 of these sessions on shelter and faith, and they're going to have a list of all the resources from each of the sessions that they're going to combine and provide to the library. And so they're going to have that for us. But let's go around. Let's start at the top of my screen anyway. Rabbi Paula, you want to begin, and then we'll move up and move down.
But first, I just want to thank Pastor Hoffman for quoting Rabbi Earl Grollman. It's not often that I'm on a call that pastor is quoting a rabbi, and I always love when it happens. So yeah, he's done a lot of work around grief, and recommend any of his books. I did send a list to the libraries, and the books will be part of that list. But I also just want to give a shout out to the Jewish Healing Center in San Francisco that has many online resources. They have every year they do a conference, a retreat called Grief and Growing, which is really beautiful because they try to create small groups of people who've had the same loss, the same death in their configuration, their constellation. And I'm sure if it's not going to be happening face-to-face, they'll be doing it online. So that's the Jewish Healing Center in San Francisco. And then a book that isn't Jewish, but partially written by someone who is, Walking Each Other Home, which was the last book that Ram Dass and Mirabai Bush put together, which Mirabai took a lot of Ram Dass's teachings about death. And then if you get the opportunity there, you can get it online, Becoming Nobody, which was the last movie made about Ram Dass and his process of preparing for his own death, which we got to see him 2 weeks before he dropped his body. So he really was very conscious about death and dying. But there are many more that'll be listed on the list that's going to come out from the library. So thanks.
Thank you. Shannon, would you like to add? Did you get everything you wanted to cover in the list that you gave us?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, great. Suzanne?
Thank you. I'm going to go to the literature side of things. I'm somebody who uses novels to understand human life. And one very beautiful book, and I will send this to the library for resources, is a very small, short book, novel called Catherwood, Catherwood, by Marley Humans. It's the story of a pilgrim woman who gets lost in the woods and gives birth to a baby, and what happens to them over the winter as she survives with the baby. And she's separated from her culture, her friends. She's terrified. She doesn't know if she can live. She doesn't know if the baby can live. It's a remarkable story. And another, one of my favorites, is A Year of Wonders, a book from 2001. And I'm sorry, it's by Geraldine Brooks. And it's the story of a plague and how the protagonist finds hope in the plague.
Very pertinent to today's world right now. That's on point. What was the title of that one again?
A Year of Wonders.
Year of Wonder.
Came out in 2001 by Geraldine Brooks.
Great. Dan, do you have more you'd like to add for us?
Sure. Before I mention one booklet, we haven't talked a lot about helping children, but my wife as a social worker gave me advice when I was working with children that it can be really helpful to have a child make a box and decorate it and paint it and color it and then fill it with pictures of grandma or dad or whoever it is they lost or sister, and fill it with favorite mementos, and it becomes their special treasure box. And that the act of making it and then the act of continuing to enjoy it can be really important for children. So I just want to mention that. But I didn't come up with a huge list of, I'm really practical. And so there's a booklet that comes out from DNA and Hospice that probably a lot of the hospices have, called When You Are Grieving. And there's another one called My Friend I Care by Barbara Carnes. And you can get probably both of those from most hospices. But what I like about little booklets is they're easy to read when you're overwhelmed. And it normalizes the grief process you're going through and gives you real practical steps on how to walk through that process. So those are both really, really good booklets that you could probably call any hospice and get. And it would be helpful.
Great. Well, we're right at our cutoff time. And so before we end here, I want to say, looking over, there was a lot of comments. If you haven't had a chance, if each of you could look through them, there's some really nice things said to each of you for what was said today. A lot of people were very touched by everything that was said. I know I was. So thank you. Anything that you feel like you didn't get to say that you wanted to leave people with before we go? Yeah, Shannon.
I just want to say that loss often gives us or invites us to reprioritize what's most important in our lives. And even though a lot of us are in survival mode because of COVID, I think that remembering to ask ourselves what gives us joy, what gives us strength, what inspires us, what have inspired others through difficult times, and to define what are our top priorities and commitments right now, that we can continue to grow even through this, because it is our choice how we respond. And that's what I would like to leave with.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Rabbi, anything you want to add on?
I was planning on, but I'm not going to, but I want to suggest that, oh, sorry, am I unmuted now?
Yes.
I was going to read, but I don't want to take the time to do this now, but Psalm 23 has been a very important piece for many of our Christian and Jewish traditions in terms of understanding that we all walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And I want to invite folks to go online and to look up Norman Fisher, who is a Zen Buddhist teacher who translated Psalm 23. And it's very, very beautiful in terms of moving from that place of grief and understanding, and moving to a place of really understanding the hope and the beauty and the loving kindness that follows us all the days of our lives.
Thank you. Reverend Semmes?
Oddly enough, I wanted to point out Psalm 39, which to me it's a very beautiful psalm exploring how transient we are, and slides very well into Buddhism as well. So thank you.
Thank you. And Reverend Hoffman, I guess we'll end with you.
Sure. Well, we're diving into the Psalms. So Psalm 46:10, be still and know that I am God. And just to know that we are in the hands of a creator that loves us dearly and will take care of us. And I think the last thing is, in working for hospice for 13 years, I come home every time from working for hospice and I give my wife a big hug. And I appreciate her. And every moment we have with our loved ones is a gift. And every moment is a chance to show them that we love them. And let's make sure we do that in this time.
Love it. Thank you. Thank you all so much. It's been a wonderful pleasure. Unless someone wants to lead sing us out, I think I'll turn it back over to the facilitator. Suzanne and Shannon, any singers? No? All right, let's go to the facilitator then. But thank you guys. It was really beautiful, and I know we enjoyed it. Did I lose my sound? Yeah.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists today for sharing your voice, your kindness, and your wisdom with all of us. On behalf of the Santa Cruz Public Libraries and the Watsonville Public Library, I'd like to thank all of our attendees for taking time out of your day to join us for part 2 of our series. We encourage you to go and register for parts 3 and 4. Those are next week. And we will post the book recommendations and this recording on our YouTube site, santacruzpl.org. Thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you again to our panelists and to Vice Mayor Tim. Take care.
Thank you.